Okay, so welcome to the last session of the day. Congratulations, you've made it this far. The happy hour tonight, an hour from now, Ben will not go late and keep you from drinks, guaranteed. We might even end a little bit early here. So drinks on the balcony, 5 p.m., third floor. Hour and a half. Invite who you want. No passes needed. So I'm going to do an introduction to Ben for this particular session. And if you've seen me running around all the rooms, this is actually the only session where I've done an introduction, and here's why. Many of us probably think we're here to talk about technology, content, or we're in the business of broadcast, distribution, etc. We're not. We're in the business of people. That's what business is about, people. If you invest in people over ideas, you win. The companies that are successful invest in the right people, build the right culture, and understand the value in individuals. I met Ben 6 years ago. Ben came out of Navy as a SEAL on a very unique team, SEAL Team 6. He's very humble. He won't talk about it. He's probably very uncomfortable right now just standing here. But I met Ben, was able to make an introduction into, at the time it was still BAMTech, just as they were being acquired by Disney streaming services. Ben came out with no technology background. After I met him, Ben got a job very quickly with BAMTech. Still wasn't living in the area, so he came and he moved in with me. And he lived with me for 4 or 5 months, training up, learning the industry, setting himself up for success. 4 years at Disney, Ben went from starting off as a project program manager, learning the industry. 4 years after Disney, went to SiriusXM satellite radio, VP. He's now running 300 people in an engineering team. People invested in him, right? That's what this is about in business. It's investing in people. It's one of the most important things you can do is build the right culture, and it starts with your people. Right? If I sound like a proud parent of Ben, it's because I am. The rate he has excelled, the lifestyle that he has lived, he has set himself and his family up for success. When you're focusing on trying to live every day with decency, sanity, and normality, and you're putting yourself and your family first, which everybody has to do, right? There's something bigger than business. But that translates to business as well in terms of how you invest in your people. So even if you have some good people, if they've gone as far as they can internally, what do? You encourage them to take that next step, even if they're going to have to leave the company they're at. This is very important. So Ben is a very unique case. For those that didn't keynote this morning, over the last 5 years, I've had many members of special operations from here. And we have a bunch in the room, you can see from the lanyards they have. So every year we get to place folks. So super grateful for the guys being here. Ben is basically the blueprint of how to be successful, even if you didn't come from the military, how to set yourself up for what you need to learn to get the job you want, to excel in that job, to get to the point of where you're managing 300 people today. It's quite the achievement. So super proud of him. I do think of all these guys as my kids, to be honest, especially when they've lived with me for a long time. So I'll let Ben kick this off, but finally, all man has in his life is character and integrity. Ben has both. And for that reason, more than any other, I'm proud to call him my friend. So thank you. Off to you.
Thanks, Dan. Introduce myself, as Dan said, I'm Ben Manning. I currently lead SiriusXM and Pandora Services, and here to talk a little bit about the next-gen platform that we built and launched at the end of last year. Oh, there we go. All right, introduction. So for some of you that were here for what Dan was talking about this morning, one of the things that he said is for these talks, he's looking for practical application that you can bring back. And so that's where I'm going to strive for, is how you can practically apply what it would look like to do a digital transformation. And so over the course of a year, we went through a monumental engineering changes from organization, also from migrating millions of users, and then launching a new platform in December of last year. Why? Why did we go through all of that work? So if you look at years of building up tech debt, as well as having, we had everything from GCP to AWS to on-prem. So it was a whole host of different environments hosted in different places with different services. We had everything from a monolithic on-prem that was challenging and fragile through to a monolithic on-prem that had been moved to AWS, but now, because they didn't change the underlying primitives, you now end up with a decentralized monolith, which honestly is almost worse than having a monolith, because now you're trying to make changes and you got to coordinate these changes across many different service stacks. So the aim of this presentation is to share insights and best practices and how, from our experience at SiriusXM of architecting and developing services at scale with the focus on performance, scalability, and reliability under a very compressed timeline. And time compression is a very challenging thing, and you all probably have felt that. The business always wants more, engineering's always asking for more time, where product is asking for you to deliver faster. So how can you think about structuring your teams for success and being able to deliver quickly, yet still having the performance, reliability, and at scale? You want to go to the next slide? You want to just drive? All right. Why did we shift our approach? So we had a lot of bespoke point solutions, not a platform and a singular way to do things. And so with that, when you look at that, so people, if you look at maintenance and you look at maintaining parallel services with similar uses, you look at internal mobility for team members. The example being is if you do not have consistency and cohesion between the services stack and between these individual teams, having an individual that moves from writing Go in a specific on-prem way, that building services, moving them over to, all right, now I need to build in AWS in Java, or I need to go move over here and build in a different language. All right, our CI/CD and deployment stacks are different. That change of changing that individual is as hard as it is of changing into a new company. So if you think of upskilling that person and all of those challenges. So for people, having the cohesion where now we can offer internal changes within teams for future opportunity and growth. So somebody on the playback team that maybe they cap out, but they're looking to become a tech lead. They're a really good IC, they're looking to become a tech lead. They don't have that option on the playback team. Now, being able to seamlessly move them over to the identity team with zero upscaling or different changes. Velocity, splitting resources across multiple deployments, instrumentation and infrastructures, it just adds unnecessary friction and fragmentation. And if you look at the velocity of being able to deliver software at scale safely into production, being able to add features and functionality quickly and safely. Security, this is a big one. When you have different ways and different fragmentation between being in GCP, AWS, and on-prem, and a whole host of how that networking goes together, you now have a much bigger security posture that you need to keep secure. Being able to consolidate that down, have a much smaller footprint, and being able to bake that in from the beginning, it allows just much better security, whether it comes from your data or from your different attack vectors. Economics. Splitting across multiple different cloud providers really dilutes your purchasing power with them. And so we had this real experience of, we went to AWS Cloud Native, but we actually invested, and they invested in their roadmap in order to meet some of our needs that we needed for last year. And they changed on our behalf. Opportunity, managing on-prem hardware, messaging brokers, load balancers, right? Like there is a lot that needs to go into that. And what I will say, and Dan touched on this morning from the business side, is businesses, and his advice to businesses was to remain focused. You take that one step further, and that's the same thing with engineers and engineering, is keeping engineers and engineering focused. I don't want to staff and build out a whole bunch of engineers that are supporting infrastructure, that are running as DBAs, right? Like I can outsource that as a managed service. And that way I can be as effective and efficient with engineering resources to focus on what the actual business value is for SiriusXM. For me, engineering, like me building out a database, is not adding value to SiriusXM, but being able to deliver the features and the business context that they need does. So being able to, again, outsource that is that opportunity cost. And then the most important is our customers, right? At the end of the day, it's what's the performance, what's the user experience, and being able to increase those and rapidly add features and functionality. Next slide. So when we kicked this off, setting the platform principles, this was like day one. All right, we need to set some platform principles that we're going for in order to have a unified view in these many different teams as we're looking. So being cloud-based, AWS cloud native, multi-tenant, building with an architecture that will allow every business within SiriusXM to interact with and to leverage a platform. And this is a really important one because this extends behind multi-tenancy, but you're always going to have individual asks from many different stakeholders. And if you individually build custom point solutions for all of the individual stakeholders that you'll have, you'll end up with, down the road, a very hard time maintaining as well as delivering value quickly. And so this is where having that platform-centric view of being able to take all of your customers and your consumers and your stakeholders and then being able to build that into a maintainable code base that now you can then add value by building in a feature set that now you get synergies on that feature set now you automatically get for your other tenants. Multi-region. This one's a big one. Doing active-active from the start. And with maximal uptime so that if we do have any issues, AWS will have issues, right? So if you do have any issues, we can fail out of that region and be running in 3 different regions active-active. And one of the keys here is like designing active-active from the start. It's extremely hard to go from a single region and then try to go active-active, hot-hot. And so what you'll see a lot of times is the whole disaster recovery. All right, well, we'll run in a single region, we'll have a disaster recovery. The challenge that you will always see with the disaster recovery model is you're continually changing code, but you're not exercising your disaster recovery nearly enough. And it's a living, breathing ecosystem that when you actually need the disaster recovery, you probably have made changes that have unknown side effects that now your disaster recovery, when you actually need it, is not going to be there. And so that was critical to build from there. And really, again, with the scalable, reliable, and performant, those being our benchmarks and our metrics of success. And I think everyone in this room would look at this slide and these principles and be like, yeah, that's software designing in 2024 and what we all should be doing. It's a lot harder to do this in practice. Like, it's easy to say the principles, and really what I want to drill into is the practical how that we did this over this past year in a compressed timeline. Timeline compressions make all of this challenging. So our architectural design, and if I had to synthesize what those principles and what all of that does, it's building services that are highly aligned and loosely coupled, allowing the individual teams to autonomously deliver business value rapidly. And so the how to execute on that is through these 4 were big ones that we established over this last year. Domain-driven design in clearly bounded context. What this means is, so Conway's Law is a real thing, and what Conway's Law is your organizational chart will map, and that will be what your software architecture looks like. So from day one, really taking a look at what our platform services software design needed to be as step one of what the right North Star for the software architecture looked like, and then changing the organizational chart to mirror and support that. So whether we like it or not, if you don't do that, the teams will, without you even knowing, will build the software designed around what your organizational chart looks like. To session state and API gateway, I'll get to that in further, and 3, event-driven architecture. And that's really just how you can keep teams decoupled and not needing to have the dependencies on each other so that they can deliver value quickly. Scala 3 and API-first collaboration, that's some ways that we were able to safely build quickly, as well as allow us keep teams working in parallel, and we'll cover that in future slides. All right, back one. There you go. Session state and domain events. So what session is here and how we design this, our services layer, to keep services decoupled, we really needed 2 concepts. Is how do you have state of a user that's immediately accessible and runtime in a synchronous call to a service. And we did that via what is shown here as session service. So you can just think of this as who the user is, what they have access to, what their profile settings are, account settings, subscriptions, entitlements, rights. And this is minted inside of a JWT token that's stored on a client. This allows at runtime, when the client calls into the platform, the metadata of that user, of who they are and what they have access to, is immediately available within that session. The second way that you can keep services decoupled is via events, and that's what you can see by the right side between service A and service B. You can have service A listening to events from service B, maintaining that state so that when that user calls into service A, it's ready and available. For session state and API gateway, it brokers all the requests into the platform. It does the heavy lookups once. And especially as we're trying to focus, and I think we all here want to focus on efficiencies, having lookups done once, stored in state within that user's context, means that we can save on compute costs and we can save on our AWS spend. Intelligent routing to underlying services, being able to handle region failover, abstracted from the individual service teams, right? Individual service teams can be building their services while independently, they don't have to worry about region failover. They don't have to design for that at all. They just design for active-active. We then have our API gateway that handles the intelligent routing. Internal workings of the platform are detached from clients. And really this one platform makes the client SDK possible. And what client SDK is we have a client team. They build an SDK for each of their different client applications. And that's how we have a consistent way to be able to build any number of front-end consumer applications. And this is just a blown-in view of what that looks like with the client SDK calling in with the JWT token. It's extracting that. It's passing it through the underlying microservices. And as you can see, we can route to region A, region B. We're in 3 different regions. So with that, you get immediate resiliency. So if we have an issue inside of US East, we can region failover, and users have no idea, right? We can, and we do already, fail out of a region, and we can then performance test in production safely because now we're region evac'd out of a region, and we can correctly mimic exactly what we have for our production environment. Services design. So this is a kind of a blueprint and a template of our services design, and you probably can't see the specifics on it, but the one thing I want to drill into, and I'll go into further slides in each sides of this is a user request coming in, and this is a template designed for a service that needs to respond with specific information about a user. So think of this as in you're browsing SiriusXM and you're seeing a client or a carousel that's recommended for you. That's based off of you. We can personalize that. Or that's you hitting the playback button, and now we need to serve you a playback URL that's customized what CDN you have, or there's other logic with DMCA rights we need to evaluate based off of can you skip, can you not skip, or that's a login or a sign up. So it's and the reason I say that is this model is not for if the same response is going for all users, because that's the classic CDN caching, which is a completely different approach. So with this, you can see that we have our synchronous, which is the client calls into the service stack, is waiting for a response, and then we have the asynchronous part of this, and we'll go into both of those. So drilling into the synchronous, if you look at this, really what I want to just double tap into outside of obviously the technologies that we're using and how we're doing this in a standard way is minimizing the dependencies down to reading and writing from DynamoDB, right? So by removing the dependencies and having the reads and writes to DynamoDB be the one thing that you're dependent on, and that you have the context to serve up for that user when they call in, means that you can have a highly performant service. And with the correct key design and the high cardinality, you can be infinitely horizontally scalable. Now, that is the key nuance there, is you do have to have the correct key design for the key value store that we used here, which is DynamoDB. But with this design, if it is done correctly, infinitely scalable horizontally, no matter what that traffic and load pattern is, and you've removed all your dependencies, so you're highly performant, because again, you're minimizing it down to the reads and writes out of DynamoDB. Now on the asynchronous side, so again, that's the synchronous side was the client calling in, immediately getting a response, it's immediately available. Hey, they're logging in, they're purchasing, or they're seeing what's recommended for them. Now on the asynchronous side, this is off the backside of DynamoDB. It's working on like what our actual eventing architecture looks like. And the key takeaway for this, and we've worked through of what this design looks like, is being able to keep decoupled any other consumer that might need the information from that producer, right? So what's this really has leveraged us to do is from another service that needs to have that view and state from something happening elsewhere in the ecosystem, or from data engineering and the data organization that then takes and ingests all of the data from the individual services, lands this into the data lake in a consistent manner. Now we can have data analytics that can run all of their analysis. You can do everything from marketing, et cetera. And that, again, it's in that event approach, and it's asynchronous, which means that we're still thinking about, and this goes back to one of the first key principles, is optimizing for the user experience. The goal is to have the fastest user experience and to have performance, but we know that there's a lot of other things that need to happen, so how do you keep that decoupling? And then going through of like kind of building quickly and building in parallel. These were some of the things that we tackled last year. Looking at Scala 3 for our services and data pipelines. It's expressive, flexible, strongly typed language on the JVM, something that we've definitely invested in here at SiriusXM and seen success on. And from boosting developer productivity. And what I will say is, so we had about a year we did this in, but for resource constraints and some other reasons, like there were areas that we had less than 6 months to build. And one of them being our playback. So our playback stack, we rebuilt the entire thing in less than 6 months. And one of the reasons we could safely do that is because of having the correct engineers that understood the patterns I'm talking about before. We didn't have to ramp them up. But also by having this expressive and flexible approach. And then with the API registry and Smithy. So Smithy is AWS's IDL. And AWS and Amazon use this approach as well. And I think this is something that's underutilized in the software engineering space. And with a contract first approach, what that means is, like, before actual code gets written, you have a clear IDL that you write out that you have agreed to from the parties and from the consumers. And what you'll typically see, at least in smaller places and even in bigger places, is It's an afterthought, which means, and when this is an afterthought, it means you need to build software synchronously. And when I mean synchronously, I mean you have the services, they need to build A, you have whatever needs to be a B, C, and at the very, very end of this, then clients then need to see what the service even does, and then it's a lot of conversation. And so with API registry and with Smithy, we actually auto-generate HTTP routes, we auto-generate clients. So this isn't like a best guess, this is like we're actually auto-generating code into our services to be able to have that safety and be able to then have teams build in parallel. So closing, some of the architectural outcomes from some of the decisions that we made were around the performance. So if you look at the performance, again, minimizing those dependencies, allowing that when a client calls into a service, that the only dependency is reading and writing from DynamoD. That is how you have high performance. Reliability and resiliency, from thinking about active-active and how you handle region failover, right? All of those being key. Scalability, from the correct design, being able to make sure that you horizontally scale as users continue to come. What you don't want to end up being in the position is where you have a max threshold that you can hit. The goal here with the correct architecture is you're infinitely scalable based off of whatever your AWS account limits are, right? Like you want to be able to auto scale infinitely, or whatever cloud service provider you're using. And then to close out, some of the new platform capabilities that came with all of this, there's many things that came with all of this. Some of the big ones is now we can be data driven. We were missing lots of data, and it was very hard to get data, and we definitely did not have data in near real time. Now with this architecture and this asynchronous approach and events across services, as well as clients then instrumenting events, now we have robust amounts of data. So rather than trying to make decisions based off of what we think consumers want, we can now actually measure it, and then we can actually make appropriate decisions, and that ties in with experimentation. Now we can run experiments at scale and rapidly figure out what do consumers want, how do we increase that consumer experience, and that ties into personalization. And I think one very interesting thing that I think shows the success is 3 weeks after we launched, 3 weeks, we shipped more code, features, improvements than we did the entire previous year. So that really shows where having the correct services architecture can allow you to quickly move and quickly get code to production safely. Whereas if you have a much more rigid or challenging, it's just much slower and much harder. So these were some of the things that we tackled over the course of a year, and I hope you all got something out of this, and we'll open it up to Q&A. Any questions?
So you showed a slide about Smithy and data contracts. How do you kind of handle for the permutation of data that can be across the fields of a data contract? Let's say that field A and field B have values like 1, 2, 3, but the permutation of 1 here and 2 here is not allowed. How do you kind of handle those kinds of situations if people aren't? You mentioned you're trying to have people not talk as often, but be able to.
So the question was around, and I'm just repeating the question for folks that might be listening. And the question was around using the Smithy and the IDL and the contract first approach. How do you, and if I understand this correctly, how do you have different understanding within each field that you make sure that you enforce? Like how do you enforce the contract? It's defined within the Smithy IDL of how you can have constraints within the fields. So if there's specific constraints that you need to have, you can actually define that within the actual IDL, as well as it even handles breaking changes. So And that's what's really good about this is when you start making, like, you can't change the actual service without a PR in our API registry. When you make the PR in the API registry, you have those definitions and those constraints that you might need. But you also then have, when it's a breaking change, that you can't actually merge that breaking change without notifying your key clients. And then, of course, there's the whole breaking change in API versioning and what that whole strategy is. That's a whole nother thing. But it's really, and we have and this is an area that we've invested in as a company that we've seen a lot of value from, is like an actual team whose sole job is that. So like if we find other issues as we go, we actually invest in this area where we're making sure that we have a core tooling team and that's their sole job. If there's no more questions, I know 5 p.m. happy hour, so hope to see you all there.